We're now on the Confederate side of the line, and we are actually very near to the left side of A.P. Hill's division. Forward of this area is an area called Bernard's Cabins, and you can see the entrenchments that were built by the Confederates, and they dug in all the way along this line. There were a lot of advantages to the defensive position that Stonewall Jackson's men had. The woods offered protection, obviously the entrenchments, the railroad, which is further to the west or to the east of here, offered some protection, but it also had some drawbacks. Chief among them was the inability to see what else was happening on the line, much like what happened at the Battle of Chickamauga or the Wilderness. Also, it made communication very difficult because you couldn't always see where the other troops were. When the defensive position was placed for the Confederates, they put Archer's brigade to my left, which would be on the right side of the Confederates, as we are about a quarter mile behind the edge of the woods where the railroad is, and beyond that is the direction from which the Union was coming. So Archer was over on this side, and on this side you had Lane's brigade. But in between was a 600-yard gap in the line. It was the only gap in a line that stretched for nearly 2 miles for Stonewall Jackson's men. And the reason for the gap was that they had scouted the area, and it's really marshy here. And the decision was made by Jackson that the Union was not going to be able to attack through there, so there was no reason to defend it. So they only left some skirmishers and nothing else. But the problem was that Archer and Lane were not okay with that. They wanted that gap plugged. So to compromise, here where I'm standing, about a quarter mile back from the line, they placed the brigade of Maxcy Gregg. Now, Gregg was somebody who, if you've seen the movie Gods and Generals, did not get along well with Stonewall Jackson. They had had some significant falling out, and that's a story for another day. But what happened was, around 1:30 in the afternoon, about an hour after the attack had started over on Marye's Heights, General Mead's division broke through and actually was approaching this position where Maxcy Gregg's brigade was. Well, if you remember, I talked about how they had to go down into those ditch fences, and they had gotten wet, they had gotten muddy. Well, you can imagine when wool uniforms get muddy and then that mud begins to dry, how it looks. Well, in these dense woods, Maxcy Gregg comes along where his men are firing, and he orders them to stop firing. He said, "You're firing on your own men." Look, he thought they were butternut uniforms, and he ordered his men to stop firing. Well, unfortunately, they were Union soldiers, and one of those Union soldiers fired a shot which severed Maxcy Gregg's spine and paralyzed him, and he passed away 2 days later from his wounds. Meade's division eventually made its way to the position where I'm at now. And you can see behind me a location near the railroad called Mead Pyramid. Well, it was actually placed there as a monument to Confederate soldiers, and it's modeled after the pyramid dedicated to the unknown soldiers buried in Hollywood Cemetery in Richmond. But it's become known as the Mead Pyramid because it's on the location of Meade's attack. Meade's division broke through all the way to the road here, which was the place that they were trying to get to, but Meade didn't know his men had made it that far. He only found out later because he was back at the edge of the woods directing the division. In a quick succession, all three of Meade's brigade commanders fell. One of them was killed, shot through the head. Another was wounded, and a third one had his horse shot and it fell on top of him, and he was down for about 20 minutes until he could be rescued from that. Meade had several close calls of his own. He had a bullet go through the top of his hat. He had another one that hit his horse. At one point at the edge of the woods, as the attack began to fail, a lieutenant ran in the other direction, and Meade tried to stop the lieutenant and order him back into the fight. The lieutenant refused, and Meade went over and whacked him on the top of his head with the flat of his sword, which broke. And that sword is actually now on display at the Gettysburg National Military Park Museum. But this was the high water mark where I'm standing for the Union lines as they eventually had to fall back because their attack was unsupported. And you can see down toward the Confederate right in the direction that I'm looking now. Well, as I'm making my way up the trail from the parking lot that leads up to the top of Telegraph Hill, which is where Lee's headquarters was during the battle, one thing I have to say, as I say with all my battlefield visits, there's always something you learn that changes your perspective on a battlefield. And so far for me, my takeaway, and I haven't been to Marye's Heights yet, so far my takeaway is how huge this battlefield is. I hadn't realized how spread out it was, how far it is from one end of Jackson's line to the end of Longstreet's line. I mean, it's gotta be, I'll look at a map, but I'm guessing it's 5 or 6 miles. It's a significant distance. There's no way anybody could have been reinforced. Everybody was so spread out. It was really, it's almost like two distinct battlefields. You have the fight at Marye's Heights. You have the fight over on the right side, Prospect Hill, that area. Two distinct battlefields happening at the exact same time. This is a 30-pound parrot. First one I've ever seen on a battlefield. This 30-pound parrot represents one of two near disasters that took place on December 13th, 1862 for the Confederate Army, because Lee's headquarters was right here. And on its 39th round that it fired that day, the 30-pound parrot that was here burst, and it sent shrapnel in every direction. It very nearly hit both General Lee and General Longstreet. Could you imagine if that had happened, if both of those men had been killed because of that shrapnel? What a disaster that would have been for the Confederacy. But that wasn't the only disaster that nearly happened that day, because later on that day, artillery fire from the Union positions on Stafford Heights, on the other side, about a mile from here, on the other side of the Rappahannock River, an artillery shell landed very near to Lee, but it didn't explode. It was a dud. Again, imagine if that shell had not been a dud, how different the story of the Civil War might have been in that situation. It's difficult to imagine now because I think the woods are denser and cover the line of sight more than they did that day, because Lee could see most of the battlefield from this spot, and these artillery pieces were firing regularly, so you have to imagine these trees probably weren't here, or at least weren't in the way. But it was while looking in this direction, watching the fight on the Confederate right, where Stonewall Jackson was trying to hold his position against Mead and Gibbon and others. It was there that, while watching the fight, standing here, that Lee was supposed to have said it as well, that war is so terrible, or we should grow too fond of it. As you can see, this hill was clear on the day of the battle, so he would have had a tremendous view. It's difficult to see that now. I wish they'd just clear those trees, but I know large parts of this battlefield are not owned by the National Park Service, and therefore they really have no control over what happens with it. There you have it. It's a 7-mile line that the Confederates were defending. They entrenched the whole thing.